Police officer shoots 10-year-old black boy in broad daylight, unarmed. A loud crack shattered the humid afternoon air, and for one searing moment, no one breathed. The sun hung high in a cobalt sky, baking the cracked asphalt of the wide city street, while dust motes floated lazily near the entrance of a small corner store. People froze in mid-stride and mid-sentence as an echo reverberated off nearby brick walls, bouncing over silent cars. A figure, slight and fragile, toppled to the ground. It was a child, a 10-year-old boy, clutching a cheap plastic basketball in one trembling hand. His eyes, wide with confusion, searched the faces around him, as if silently asking what had just happened. Within seconds, a scream tore through the silence. The boy's name was Carver, and he was known throughout the neighborhood for his relentless energy and bright, beaming smile. He ran errands for his elderly neighbor. He loved sugary popsicles in the summertime. He played basketball until the streetlights came on. He was also black, and that single fact, combined with an instant of misguided terror, had turned a routine afternoon into a tragedy that no one would soon forget. Officer stood a few steps away, his service weapon raised and trembling in his hand. His lips were parted in shock, an anguished exhalation etched into his face. He hadn't meant for it to end like this. He was convinced he had seen a threat. He had heard the crack of something hitting the pavement, and just for an instant, he believed his own life was in mortal danger. Instinct roared through him. All his training, all the fear hammered into him about split-second decisions, about better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6, compressed into a single unstoppable reflex. He fired before his brain could process that the threat was just a frightened child dropping his ball. Lay on the ground, a crimson stain spreading across his simple white t-shirt. His lips parted in ragged, shallow gasps, struggling for breath. The toy ball rolled into the street, bumping against a curb. Panic rippled through every onlooker in that moment, the entire world seeming to tilt off its axis. And though the bullet had torn a hole in flesh and bone, the real wound was even more massive, a wound in trust, in faith, in the basic sense of safety that every person tries to cling to. Neighbors burst through their front doors, drawn by the thunder of the gunshot. A mother in a floral apron shrieked so loudly she dropped her grocery bag, oranges and apples tumbling away. A group of teenagers who had been skateboarding down the block skidded to a dead stop, staring in dismay. The corner store clerk, who until that moment had been fiddling with a jammed cash register, rushed out to see small form lying unmoving on the sidewalk. At the center of it all, his eyes rolled back, flooding with tears, panic written on every line of his face. "Mommy," he gasped. It came out a weak whisper, his voice trembling with both shock and the primal terror of a 10-year-old who has just been forced to face something no child should ever have to confront. The possibility of dying in the street. Officer remained frozen, gun half lowered, torn between training that demanded he maintain control of the situation and the raw humanity that screamed inside him that he'd just shot a little boy. He tried to speak something, anything, but only a strangled croak escaped his dry throat. He was a man in his late 30s with a wife and 2 kids at home, kids close in age too. Until that moment, his days were full of the usual: traffic stops, the occasional domestic dispute, maybe a stolen bicycle. He was not a man who craved violence or sought out conflict, no matter how the uniform might lead people to believe otherwise. But in that fraction of a second, overshadowed by an atmosphere of tension and fear that had become all too common in these parts of the city, he had pulled the trigger. The crowd that gathered surged forward, horrified and enraged. A frantic voice called out, "Call an ambulance." Another voice shouted, "Somebody get his mother." A man sprinted away to find her, legs pounding the pavement in a desperate race. His partner, Officer Maria Santos, a tall woman with kind eyes that now brimmed with shock, rushed to the fallen boy's side. She pressed down on the bleeding wound, ignoring the boy's frightened whimpers. "It's okay," she whispered through tears. "We're gonna get help." His face pinched in pain and fresh terror shimmered in his eyes. "Mommy," he repeated, as if that one word might be enough to fix everything. Meanwhile, his mind was a roaring storm of guilt, fear, and confusion. Training told him to secure the weapon, secure the scene, call it in, but none of that felt sufficient or even possible under the crushing weight of what he had just done. He saw a father's face in his mind, his own. He pictured his daughter with her curly pigtails, his son with that toothy grin. Each image stabbed into him with the harsh realization that he'd just put a bullet in a child not unlike his own. Distantly, he was aware of his radio crackling, of his name being called, "Respond, come in," but he couldn't move. It was as if his entire soul had left his body, leaving behind an empty uniform that struggled to recall the simplest protocol. A wave of sirens erupted in the distance, moving closer by the second. The crowd heaved with heartbreak and fury, some screaming profanities, others weeping openly, still others standing in disbelief at what had just played out on a quiet afternoon beneath a scorching sun. This was a scene that had been repeated far too often in headlines across the country, each incident fueling bitterness, sorrow, and a haunting sense that justice, for some, was forever out of reach. But today it was their block, their child. Its mother, Carver, careened around the corner seconds before the ambulance arrived. She wore a wrinkled shirt and sweatpants, having been relaxing at home after a grueling shift at the hospital cafeteria. She looked so young, just in her late 20s, petite and delicate, but the anguish in her wide brown eyes made her appear much older. She took in the sight of her son on the ground, blood seeping through Officer Santos's hands where she pressed desperately on the wound, and she let out a wail that might have cracked the sky. She dropped to her knees beside him, her arms trembling as she hovered over her bleeding child. His lips parted to greet his mother, but he could only manage a broken cough. He was still conscious but dimming, his eyes drifting in and out of focus. "Mommy," he murmured, "I'm sorry." "No, no, baby, no," his voice quavered. She placed her hand gently against his cheek, tears splashing onto his face. "Hold on, baby, you're going to be okay. You're going to," she turned suddenly, eyes blazing with desperation. "Help him," she cried at the paramedics who burst from the ambulance. They rushed to his side, peeling away Santos's hands and carefully placing pressure bandages over the wound. They were quick and methodical, but beneath that practiced composure lay the same horror shared by everyone on that street. Officer Santos stepped back, her gloves stained red, tears carving lines down her cheeks. She looked over to, who stood rooted like a statue on the sidewalk, and for a moment her gaze was one of heartbreak and betrayal. "What did you do?" her eyes seemed to say, though her lips never formed the words, but heard them anyway. Was whisked onto a stretcher, the paramedics chanting coded phrases into their radios, trying to maintain a calm that belied the chaos of a child's life slipping through their hands. Held her son's hand as they lifted him into the ambulance, refusing to let go for even a second. The doors slammed shut, tires squealed, and the ambulance tore down the street, leaving behind a swirl of red and blue lights and the raw cries of onlookers. In that swirl, Officer found himself painfully alone. His partner had rushed to the patrol car to radio the station, to alert them of the shooting, while he remained behind, gun still in hand. Slowly, as if in a daze, he holstered it, trying to will his shaking fingers to work. The smell of burnt gunpowder stung his nostrils, an acrid reminder that he'd actually fired a shot. Everything felt surreal, like someone else had done this, like he was watching it happen on television. But the reality was plain for everyone to see. There was a toddler in a stroller, an innocent bystander, staring with wide, uncomprehending eyes at the policeman who had just shot a little boy. There was a father with a baseball cap, tears streaming down his face, gripping his own child's hand as if he would never let go. There was an older woman, perhaps in her 70s, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, who leaned against a mailbox, her face covered in trembling hands. And there was Officer, a man who, in an instant, had committed an act he would never be able to undo. The crowd began to shift, anger mingling with sorrow. Whispers turned into shouts. Cameras were pulled out, phone screens capturing every moment, every angle. Some people demanded Spage, demanded justice, demanded his immediate arrest. Others stood quietly, numb with a grief too heavy to articulate. The tension in the air hissed like steam from a pressure cooker, threatening to explode at any second. Finally, his radio crackled with a command from the precinct. He was to return to the station immediately and give his statement. He took a step forward, intending to comply, but the mass of onlookers had thickened into an unyielding wall. Their faces were a sea of fury, heartbreak, and betrayal. He felt a deep wave of shame crest inside him, threatening to sweep him away. He had to force himself to keep walking, step by step, until he reached his patrol car. Inside, Officer Santos sat behind the wheel, stony-faced, her own expression bleak. They drove off amid the wails of sirens from other arriving units. The cruiser's departure left behind a vacuum, as if the very spirit of that neighborhood had been siphoned away with the bullet that struck the child. In the following hours, the city's heartbeat thundered with anguish. Word spread like wildfire. News stations scrambled to get camera crews on the scene. Headlines flashed across screens in every local diner and living room. Unarmed child shot by police. Social media posts by the thousands, each with the same horrifying headline, variations of the same question asked. How could a trained officer mistake a little boy for a mortal threat? Inside the hospital's emergency room, fluorescent lights and the smell of disinfectant offered no comfort to, as she sat waiting for the doctors to finish surgery on her son. She trembled with every breath, replaying the moment again and again. How just 5 minutes before, had asked for permission to go to the corner store to buy a sports drink and a candy bar with his allowance. How she had smiled and told him to be back before long. How he had bounded out the door with that innocent grin. How she thought she'd hear the door slam behind him and then the typical squeak of his sneakers when he returned. Instead, she heard sirens, and minutes later a frantic neighbor hammered on her door. The memory made her stomach twist, wiped at her tear-soaked cheeks, feeling as though a chasm had opened in her life. Her world was that boy, her only child, her beautiful son. If she lost him, she would lose everything. She shuddered at the possibility, anger burning in her veins at the same time. How dare that officer? How dare he see a child and perceive him as a deadly threat? The raw confusion and rage churned together in a toxic mix. Meanwhile, behind bulletproof glass and drab gray walls at the local precinct, officers sat in an interrogation room, though it was more an interview room by official terms. A detective he'd worked with in the past stood across from him, arms crossed, expression unreadable, recounted his version of events in a hollow voice, describing the call that had led him to the area. A report of suspected vandalism. They seen a figure with something in his hand. They told him to stop. Something banged. He was sure it was a gun. He told the boy to freeze. When the boy turned, felt an adrenaline spike so fierce it blurred his sight. He fired, and a second later, he saw it was just a ball, not a weapon. There was a silence so thick that thought he could hear his own heartbeat. The detective sighed, rubbing his temples. The official statement was typed up, the policeman's protocol was set in motion, and the department placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. Even as they followed the script of procedure, everyone there knew the gravity of what had happened. In a city that had weathered months of tension between law enforcement and communities of color, this event felt like a lit match dropped on a fuse. Beyond the station, beyond the hospital walls, entire neighborhoods were organizing. Furious calls to action echoed across social media, and by nightfall, the streets were filled with a throng of people holding handmade signs, chanting his name. He's just a child, they cried, tears in their eyes, voices raw with sorrow and fury. His life matters. Television reporters like ants, sticking microphones in front of community leaders and activists. The city's mayor swiftly released a statement, calling for calm, calling for due process, but the mayor's pleas rang hollow to those whose fear and anger had been validated once more by a bullet. Rumors swirled that the city would see its largest protest in decades. By the time the evening news hit, coverage of the incident dominated every channel. Footage from cell phones showed the immediate aftermath, officers standing stiff with the gun still in his hand, the boy bleeding on the pavement. The visuals alone were damning, igniting heartbreak and fury in equal measure. In a matter of hours, the case reverberated nationwide. It became a flashpoint for discussions on racism, policing, and the value placed on Black lives. Inside a small waiting room in the hospital's surgical wing, received word that her son was out of surgery. The bullet had torn through muscle, splintered a small section of bone, and nicked an artery, causing significant blood loss. The doctors had managed to stop the bleeding, had pieced together the bones as best they could, but his condition was critical. They wouldn't know the full extent of damage for some time. Sank into a chair, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Relief that had survived thus far mingled with the dread of what might come next. Infection, complications, the potential for lasting injury, or worse, if his body gave out. When she was finally allowed to see him, he lay in a dim recovery room, attached to tubes and monitors that beeped softly. A small oxygen mask covered his nose and mouth. His skin looked ashen, far too pale for a child so full of life. His heart cracked anew at the sight. She approached him gingerly, unsure if she should speak or simply hold his hand. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here, baby." She sank into a chair at his bedside and wept softly, brushing a gentle hand over his forehead. The door to the hospital room stayed open, allowing a rotating stream of nurses and doctors to come in, check vitals, adjust machines, and slip away, each wearing an expression that ranged from pity to steely professionalism. Hours bled into days, each one feeling both interminably long and frighteningly short. While clung to life under flickering fluorescent lights, the city outside roiled. Nighttime saw crowds surging around the police precinct, city hall, and other symbolic locations. Some protests turned chaotic after nightfall, with broken windows and the hiss of tear gas. Yet even in the midst of chaos, a poignant unity formed among many residents, a determination that a child, not be forgotten or reduced to just another statistic. The boy's name was chanted over and over, and pictures of his smiling face, taken at a neighborhood barbecue, circled across the news and internet, reminding everyone of his youth and innocence. Officer watched the coverage from the privacy of his home, forced to remain there under administrative leave. Initially, he couldn't bring himself to turn on the TV, but the silence grew unbearable. His wife was distraught, and their children, only 7 and 10 themselves, sensed the tension, though they didn't fully understand it. Hardly 8. A leaden weight pressed constantly on his chest, a tormenting voice in his head repeating that he was a monster. When he did glance at the news, he saw his own photograph, sometimes with the word killer scrawled across it in outraged protest signs. But it was the sight of his face that ripped him apart the most. Seeing that boy's bright smile, so full of promise, he felt something in him unravel. A kaleidoscope of images from that day tormented his waking hours and haunted his dreams. The sound of the gunshot echoed through his mind without end. He spent many long nights in the dark, turning the events over and over, trying to justify what he'd done, trying to rationalize that he had perceived a threat. But the raw truth always emerged. He'd looked at a small black child and seen, if only for a flash, a deadly threat. And that single moment of fear, of a reflex hammered by years of dread and caution, had stolen away a boy's safety, his health, maybe even his future. No amount of policy or training guidelines could quell sense of guilt. Across town was its bedside almost constantly, occasionally convinced by the nurses to take a few hours, break to shower, eat, and attempt some rest. The media had approached her for statements, but she'd sent them away. She wanted no cameras in her face. She wanted to devote every ounce of strength to her son's recovery. She spoke to him softly while he slept, whispered prayers, told him stories about how, when he was little, he used to blow bubbles in the summer sun and chase them across the yard. She promised him that once he woke up, she'd buy him the best basketball she could find, a real one, not the cheap plastic ball. She begged him to get better so they could do all the things they'd planned, an upcoming family barbecue, a new video game he'd wanted. She tried to keep her voice steady. Even though he was unconscious most of the time, she believed he could hear her. The hours were brutal. The doctors said had a fragile hold on life, that the bullet had done a lot of damage. The kids can be resilient, they added. They reminded her that sometimes children amaze everyone with their ability to heal. Her hope swelled at those words, even as fear gnawed at the edges of her heart. On the second day after the shooting, finally stirred, soft moans escaped his cracked lips, jolted upright, calling for a nurse. His lids fluttered, revealing dark eyes clouded by pain. "Mommy." He croaked, his voice faint, barely audible around the dryness in his throat. A sob of relief exploded from his chest. She stroked his arm, tears dripping onto his bed sheets. "I'm here, baby, I'm here." He struggled to breathe, confusion twisting his features. "Hurts," he whispered, and fought back another sob, forcing a shaky smile. "I know," she said, wiping her tears. You've been hurt, but the doctors are taking care of you. You're safe, just rest." He tried to move, to shift, but the pain forced a whimper. His eyes brimmed with tears. The nurse arrived, gently administering another dose of pain medication, speaking in a soothing tone, explaining that he needed to lie still. A few minutes later, he drifted back to a shallow sleep. But that moment, that fleeting communication, was a balm for his wounded soul. His life, at least for now, remained in his body. Out in the corridor, a heavier presence had arrived, guards. The media's attention on the boy had become intense, and the hospital administration, along with some local officials, decided they needed to protect him, and from an onslaught of cameras or unwelcome visitors. Rumors had surfaced that certain extremist groups were bent on using the tragedy for their own ends, some to stoke violent outrage, others to discredit the boy's story altogether. The hospital staff huddled to ensure, and had some semblance of peace as the city outside raged. That day, got a call she never expected. A representative from the police department asked her if she would be open to meeting with officer, who wanted to offer an apology. His hands clenched around her phone so tightly they hurt. She was silent for a long while, tears burning behind her eyes as the memory of that day flared up. Her mind pictured his face, shock and fear warring in his expression as her son bled. She hung up without answering. By the third day, public pressure was at a boiling point. Everyone demanded answers. The district attorney's office announced an official investigation, stating that if there was sufficient evidence of wrongdoing, criminal charges would be filed. Community organizers pressed for immediate arrest, citing what they claimed was a clear case of an unjustified shooting. Protests roared across the city and even spread to neighboring towns. Traffic was blocked in some areas. The mayor held press conferences, urging calm, but admitting that the city owed the Carver family justice. Opinion pieces in newspapers described the incident as yet another indictment of systemic issues in policing. Counterarguments trickled in from certain corners, claiming it was an unfortunate accident, that the officer must have had reason to feel threatened. Each viewpoint battered the airwaves, swirling into a thunderstorm of blame, sorrow, and the desire for accountability. All the while's condition improved in painfully slow increments. He opened his eyes more often, communicated in whispers, and stared out the window, his eyes dull from medication and unspoken fear. Sometimes he seemed to stare at something beyond the window, beyond the present reality. Tried to coax him to talk, but he would drift back to fitful sleep. He seemed uncertain, perhaps traumatized by the sudden, violent upheaval of his safe world. One afternoon found him weeping silently, tears dripping into the pillow. She rushed to his side. "Baby, what's wrong? Are you hurting?" Shook his head, pressing his lips together. I didn't do nothing wrong, Mommy," he whispered. His small hand, still taped to an IV, gripped the blanket. I didn't." She pulled him close, careful not to jostle the tubes or his bandaged side. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice fierce, trembling with emotion. "Not a thing." The doctors warned that there would be a long road to physical recovery, but the emotional damage could be even more severe. The hospital set up a child psychologist to visit, and though he said little at first, the sessions offered at least a space for him to explore his fear. Meanwhile, the outside world demanded interviews, statements, demands that were mostly met with silence from mother and son. They were too busy surviving, but one evening, turned on the television in the hospital room and watched a press conference given by the local chief of police. He spoke in measured tones about accountability, fairness, and cooperation with the DA's investigation. Then at the end, he mentioned by name and said, "On behalf of the entire department, we are deeply sorry for this tragedy." Felt no comfort in that. She flipped the TV off. Her child nearly died. A bullet tore through him. A smile from the top brass wouldn't fix that gaping wound in her life. It was only a day later when, in the early morning hush of the hospital corridor, a figure appeared at his door. Nearly dropped the paper cup of coffee she was holding. Officer Santos, still in uniform. She looked exhausted, deep circles under her eyes. Her posture was uncertain as she hovered near the doorway, as if waiting for permission to come inside. Stared at her, heart hammering. There was so much anger coiled inside her, but also a flicker of curiosity. This was the other officer, the one who had immediately tried to stop bleeding. The one who had placed her hands over the wound, tears in her eyes. She had tried to save him. "Mrs. Carver," Santos said quietly, not stepping inside until invited. "I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to see if was doing okay." Uncertain glanced over at her boy, who was dozing in the bed. The machines beeped softly. She folded her arms, swallowing the bitterness that rose in her throat. "He's stable," she said, her voice clipped. "He's in pain, but he's alive, thank God." Santos nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm glad, I've been praying for him." She cleared her throat, gaze dropping to the floor. "I'm so sorry this happened." Said nothing for a moment, unsure if words could convey the hurt and anger that roiled inside. But she saw a sincerity in the officer's face. With a bitter edge, she replied, "Sorry doesn't change what happened." "I know," Santos said softly. "I'm not here to excuse anything. I was the one who called for the ambulance right away. She stumbled over her words as if she was terrified of making things worse. "I had to do something. I wish I could change what happened. If it helps at all, I'll testify to everything I saw, and I'll do whatever it takes." I told them I'm cooperating fully with the investigation. His lips quivered. A tiny voice inside her recognized that Santos was indeed trying, that she'd tried to save, that she was being forthcoming. But that same voice was drowned by the avalanche of emotions swirling through her. She nodded stiffly, hugging herself. "Thank you for trying to help my son," she finally managed. Santos exhaled like a tension inside her broke. A watery smile flitted across her face. "He's a strong kid," she said. "He'll pull through." Could only nod. Officer Santos hesitated, then gently placed a small stuffed bear with a bandage around its chest on the windowsill near Sped. Without another word, she left, her steps echoing down the hallway. Blinked, staring at the stuffed bear, a kind gesture that gave her no solace, yet it moved something small inside her. A sense that maybe, not everyone in uniform was her enemy. But that realization only deepened the complexity of her pain. At times, was plagued by nightmares, his small body thrashing in the hospital bed. He'd wake up gasping, tears streaking his cheeks, terrified that someone was coming to hurt him again. Each time would hold his hand, or hold him if his IV lines allowed. She whispered lullabies she used to sing when he was younger. She told him he was safe with her. The doctors assured her that healing from such a traumatic event would take more than a little time. On the fourth night, alone and exhausted, mustered the strength to turn on the television again, carefully modulating the volume so as not to disturb. A somber news anchor described how a grand jury might soon be convened to consider charges against Officer. Images of the protests filled the screen, thousands gathered, many with candles, some kneeling in silent vigil. Graffiti had appeared in pockets of the city, some reading "Justice for," others more vulgar or raging about the police. The anchor turned to a panel of legal experts who debated the complexities of law, of reasonable fear, of split-second decisions. Oleg's heart pounded. She was angry that this was even a debate. Could any rational person think it was reasonable to shoot a 10-year-old with a plastic ball? She snapped off the TV and pressed her palm to her forehead, trying to quell the rising tide of grief. Yet in that moment, she thought about how her father used to warn her about the world, how to be careful, how to keep her head down, how to avoid any potential altercation with the police. She remembered him saying, "The world ain't always fair. You gotta be smart." Now, she recognized the painful truth. Being careful isn't always enough when one is perceived as a threat simply by existing. The brutal lesson had reached her precious son far too soon. While battled her inner demons, was enduring his own version of a nightmare. He'd been summoned to speak with department psychologists, who tried to parse out what happened in the heat of the moment. Found it impossible to articulate his swirling sense of remorse, confusion, and the primal fear that had lit up his nerves that day. It was as if a shadow had lodged itself inside him, whispering that he was irredeemable, that no matter what might come of the investigation, he had ended any chance of living a normal life. He'd see that boy's face, those wide, terrified eyes, every time he closed his own. His wife begged him to talk to someone to open up, but he felt any admission to her might be a betrayal of a stoic front he believed he had to keep. The pressure mounted. The only time he broke was late at night, when he cried into his pillow, muffling his sobs so his children wouldn't hear. He made a feeble attempt to explain the situation to his 10-year-old son, David, who was old enough to watch the news in passing. But how could he explain that he had nearly killed a child? David's confused eyes still haunted him as he had asked, "Dad, did you shoot a kid like me?" "Oh, yes, but it was an accident," had choked out, tears burning his eyes. He hated himself in that moment, hated every day that had led to that single instant. On the fifth day, a swirl of activity took over the hospital corridor, was being moved from the ICU to a general pediatric ward. His vital signs were stronger, though he still experienced severe pain. Kept vigil by his side, ignoring the constant hum of her phone. Calls came in from concerned friends, extended family, and strangers who wanted to express support, or, sometimes, to press into making a statement to the media. But all she cared about was her son's recovery. Eyes fluttered open more often. He started asking for water, for comfort, for stories, with a forced smile, trying to give him a sense of normalcy. She would tell him about the silly jokes he used to make when he was in kindergarten, about how proud she was of his performance in last month's school spelling bee. At times she watched a fleeting ghost of a smile cross his face, but it never stayed. He was too anxious, too wounded, physically and emotionally. The bullet had shattered not just bone and flesh, but trust in the world around him. Outside, the city seemed on the brink of a more explosive reaction. Rumor had it that the DA's office was close to making an announcement about whether they'd file criminal charges against. Everywhere, people held their breath, tension mounting. Some demanded that the DA file first-degree attempted murder charges. Others argued for manslaughter, others that it was an accident. Media coverage dissected every angle, every bit of breaking news, real or speculative. Protesters organized a massive rally, with a planned march past the courthouse. The police presence was expected to be enormous, further rattling everyone's nerves. In the midst of that turbulence, a quiet conversation took place in the hospital corridor. Had been approached once more by a police department representative, not only to see if she would meet with, but also to handle formalities, arranging an interview with internal affairs investigators, planning for how statements would be recorded. That night she sat with a social worker, an older woman with gentle eyes who asked her what she wanted to do. "I want justice," said bitterly. "I want that man to pay for what he did to my son." Her voice shook. But I don't know if seeing him helps or just makes it worse. The social worker nodded sympathetically. Sometimes, meeting face to face can bring clarity or at least give you a chance to speak your truth, she said softly. But only you can decide if you're ready for that. Swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. Was she ready? Could she ever be ready to face the man who had tried to kill her baby, or at least that was how she saw it? And yet she sensed that maybe if she confronted him, saw his face, forced him to see hers, she might pry loose some of the weight on her soul. She thought of lying in bed, pale and trembling, and a wave of rage flooded her, so strong she could hardly breathe. Then she remembered the warmth of his little hand, the slight smile he gave her when she told him about the funny chicken joke he'd come up with last year. Another tear slipped free. "I'll think about it," she said, feeling that even saying those words was a step she hadn't been ready for yesterday. That same night, prayed in his living room. He wasn't a devout man. He attended church occasionally with his family, but for the most part, faith was a quiet afterthought. Now he found himself kneeling on the rug, hands clasped, tears pooling. He prayed for recovery. He prayed for forgiveness from God, from the boy's mother, from the entire community. The silence that followed felt deafening, like the entire universe was unwilling to respond. Eventually, he dragged himself to bed, though sleep brought him no relief. 2 days later, his condition improved enough that he could move about very carefully. The bullet had damaged his shoulder and grazed an area near his ribs, so he needed to keep his arm in a sling. Doctors spoke optimistically about eventual recovery, though they cautioned he might need physical therapy and the emotional scars might require counseling for months or years. Fussed over him, adjusting pillows, fluffing blankets, helping him with his food. He said little, his eyes often downcast, but he was alive, present, and that fact alone was a miracle in her eyes. Then came the day of the DA's announcement. The hospital room TV was muted, but couldn't tear her eyes away from the live feed as the district attorney stepped up to a podium surrounded by reporters. The city's crest hung on a banner behind him. After a deep breath, he began reading from a prepared statement. "We have concluded our review of the evidence and have decided to bring charges against Officer." A murmur of shock and relief rippled through the crowd. The charges include felony assault with a firearm and reckless endangerment. Furthermore, we will present the case to a grand jury to see if additional charges such as attempted manslaughter are warranted. Ola's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the top-tier offense that some were clamoring for, but it was a start. Would not walk away free from consequences, at least not without a legal fight. She turned the volume down further, her hand trembling. She looked at who had awakened, blinking at the screen. He read the captions, large text scrolling across the bottom. "Officer who shot 10-year-old black boy in broad daylight to face charges." She wasn't sure how much of it he absorbed. His brow furrowed, then he slowly turned away from the TV, gazing out the window. Her heart squeezed, thinking of the confusion he must feel. The news triggered immediate reactions citywide. Some expressed relief that the justice system was finally taking steps. Others were skeptical, pointing out past incidents where charges had been filed, but convictions were elusive. Protests continued, though they carried a more hopeful edge, with many seeing the potential for a court date as a chance for the system to do right. Meanwhile, lawyers prepared a defense, stating that he had acted within the realm of reason, given the perceived threat. The argument alone renewed anger in those who believed no possible reason could justify shooting an unarmed child. When stepped into the hospital corridor for a breather, she nearly bumped into a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a crisp suit. He introduced himself as part of the city's prosecutorial team. Immediately bristled, but she forced herself to remain calm. The man was there to let her know that they intended to call her as a primary witness at any trial, to describe suffering, and to share about the impact on him and the family. She said she would comply, she'd do anything to see justice served. In the quiet that followed, she recalled the social worker's words about meeting. Something within her stirred, a blend of dread and resolve. Days passed and she kept turning it over in her mind. Could she look him in the eye? Could she say the words she'd been wanting to scream for days, that he was reckless and had stolen her child's innocence? When word came from the social worker that had formally extended a request to meet, an apology, an explanation, or something akin to that, his heart pounded. She looked at who was practicing small exercises with his left arm under the nurse's guidance. She wondered if it would help to hear from the officer, or if it would just rip open the wound. Finally, one gray morning, with a light drizzle tapping the hospital windows, gave her answer. She would meet with officer, but only if it was a private meeting with a mediator present, and only if didn't have to see him unless he chose to. The arrangement was made swiftly, as everyone felt a sense of urgency. The hospital provided a small conference room. The lighting was harsh, the table was a battered wooden piece probably older than, and the chairs squeaked. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman with an air of gentle authority, sat at one end at the other. A door opened and stepped in, looking pale and thinner than the last time had seen him. He wore a rumpled dress shirt and slacks, his hair combed but lacking the crispness of a uniform. She felt a wave of conflicting emotions, a hot flush of rage followed by an odd pity. He looked like a broken man. They sat. His eyes flitted everywhere before finally meetings. Instantly, tears shimmered in his gaze. He swallowed audibly. The mediator cleared her throat. "We're here today to facilitate a conversation. Officer, please remember that this meeting is not a legal proceeding. Mrs. Carver has agreed to this out of her own willingness. Let's try to be respectful." Gave a short nod, clasped his hands together. His voice cracked when he spoke. I don't even know where to begin," he said, eyes downcast. "I'm so sorry. What I did, I wish I could take it back. I know that sorry isn't enough. I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know, I never wanted to hurt your son." His jaw clenched, she felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. "Then why did you? He's 10. He was carrying a ball. You had all the power in that situation. He had none." His face twisted in anguish. It was a split-second mistake. I thought," he paused, shaking his head. "I thought he had a weapon. I was scared. I've been on edge, we all have, with everything that's been happening. I'm not trying to make excuses, but I swear I saw something, heard a crack," and he stopped, tears sliding down his cheeks. "I should have taken a moment. I should have seen him, really seen him, but I didn't." Could barely contain herself. "You're right," she said in a low, trembling voice. "You didn't see him. You saw something else, some monster you were afraid of. But he's a little boy, my baby, and now he might never be the same again. He has nightmares. He doesn't talk much. He flinches at every noise. That's on you." Her voice rose, thick with tears. "You stole his sense of safety." Nodded, his own tears coming in waves. "I know, and I hate myself for it." A heavy quiet draped over the room. The mediator offered a tissue box to, who took one and dabbed her cheeks. It felt surreal sitting face to face with the man who'd nearly killed her son, seeing him weep. It didn't quell her rage, but it complicated it. Here was a human being, flawed and broken, whose single action had shattered her life. They sat there, words tangled in emotion. Finally, spoke again, haltingly. "I have a son too. He's your boy's age. When I go home, I see him, and I think about lying on that pavement. I can't eat, can't sleep. I know I don't deserve your compassion, but I need you to know that I'm going to plead guilty if it comes to that. I won't fight it. That's how sorry I am." A strange flutter of relief and bitterness passed through. "That's the least you can do," she said, voice still shaky. "I don't want any deals or pleas that downplay what you did. My son almost died." Nodded, covering his face with his hands, shoulders shaking with sobs. The mediator gently reminded them both to breathe, to take a moment. Pressed her palm to her chest, tears streaming more freely now. She pictured as a toddler, chasing after a balloon at a birthday party, pure joy in his eyes. Then she pictured him on the hospital bed, pale, frightened, his innocence ripped away. "What do you want from me?" asked in a whisper, voice muffled by his hands. "What can I do to make it right?" His laughter came out ragged and humorless. "You can't fix this. Nothing will make it right." Her gaze hardened. "The only thing I want from you is the truth in court when you testify, so there's no question about what happened. No question that you fired out of fear of a child. No question that he was unarmed. No question about your regret. Let everyone see the truth, raw as it is. Maybe then, some good can come from this if it forces people to look at what's really happening." Dropped his hands, eyes red. "I promise," he said. "I'll tell the truth, no matter the consequences." For a long moment, they just looked at each other, two people on opposite shores of a tragedy. Tears fell again and she stood abruptly, unsure if she could handle another second in the same room. She needed air. She needed to be anywhere else. As she turned toward the door, spoke once more, voice shaking. "Mrs. Carver, please tell He hesitated, swallowing. "Tell him I'm praying for him every day." She paused, not looking back. "He doesn't want to hear your name right now, but if he ever does, I'll let him know." Without waiting for a reply, she left the room, shoulders heaving with sobs the moment she reached the hallway. The mediator stayed behind, quietly consoling, who crumpled in on himself. That meeting, though brief, set the stage for what came next, a swirl of media coverage, the formal hearing, and the potential trial. Days turned into weeks, with recovering slowly at home after he was finally discharged. Though his wound had healed enough not to require constant hospital care, he still attended regular therapy sessions and doctor's appointments to monitor his progress. Took a leave from her job, living on a mix of savings, crowdfunding support from sympathetic strangers, and donations gathered by friends. Was quieter than ever. He spent hours sitting on the couch, drifting in and out of uneasy naps or staring at the television without really watching. Sometimes, convinced him to try drawing or reading, activities he used to love, but his interest was fleeting. Neighbors brought gifts and well wishes, many from the block to show their support, offering meals and small donations. Yet spirit stayed subdued. He no longer begged to go outside to play basketball or race around the corner. In fact, he barely wanted to set foot beyond their front door. The world outside had become a place of danger in his eyes. One evening, quietly slid onto the couch next to him and draped an arm around his shoulders. She told him how proud she was of him for surviving, for being strong. She told him she wished she could take his pain away, that she'd switch places with him in an instant if it meant he could be carefree again. He just nodded, lips trembling. A single tear escaped his eye. He mumbled, "I was just going to get a drink and some candy, Mom, that's all." The simplicity of that statement and the heartbreak beneath it cracked wide open. She held him tightly, whispering that none of it was his fault, over and over, until he finally fell asleep. Meanwhile, the city's tension persisted. Protests demanded justice, demanded change in the police department's training, demanded the defunding of certain divisions, demanded accountability. Some of these demands were met with official panels and committees, all of which made big promises. Others claimed it was an overreaction, that the shooting was an isolated incident. Emotions flared on both sides. Eventually, the day arrived when appeared in court for his arraignment. The swirl of cameras outside the courthouse was overwhelming. Chose not to attend that day, not wanting to face the media frenzy. Still, she watched the coverage from home, seeing in a plain suit, head bowed as a charge of felony assault was read, along with reckless endangerment. His lawyer entered a plea of not guilty, though speculation arose that a plea bargain might be in the works. When asked about the child, his lawyer simply said, "We are deeply sorry for his injuries, but my client will exercise his right to a fair trial." Outrage rippled through the community, felt the sting of betrayal again. Hadn't told her he'd own up to what he did. She tried to quell her fury, reminding herself that the legal process was complicated. Maybe the not guilty plea was a strategic move. But doubt nibbled at the edges of her hope. She dreaded going through a full trial, dreaded the possibility of hearing arguments that tried to paint as somehow responsible. Despite that background noise of turmoil, made small steps in therapy, both physical and psychological. He managed to pick up a basketball one afternoon, dribbling a few times in the driveway before tears flooded his eyes. He dropped the ball and ran back inside, just gave him space, understanding that healing would come at its own pace. Weeks stretched into months, the city simmered. Eventually, a trial date was set. Supporters gathered around, encouraging her to stay strong. She prepared herself mentally for the possibility of testifying, of facing the defense attorneys who might question every detail. She thought about his tearful promise in that conference room and wondered if he'd keep it. On the morning of the trial, the courthouse was a fortress. Rows of police formed barriers to keep the press and protesters at bay. Arrived with her attorney, holding a trembling by the hand. He was still so thin, his face marked by a slight scar near his temple from where he hit the ground that day. Cameras flashed as they entered. She held him close, trying to shield him from the chaos. A roar of chanting voices echoed in the street, some from demanding conviction, others from counter who claimed the officer was being railroaded. The tension was suffocating. Inside the courtroom, and sat with their lawyer. Sat at the defense table, looking just as tormented as before, his eyes darting toward with an expression that might have been apology or desperation. The judge hammered the gavel, and the proceedings began. Prosecutors laid out the case, describing in vivid detail how shot an unarmed child who posed no threat. The defense argued that the noise and sudden movement triggered a reasonable fear for his life. Each witness was called in turn, including Officer Santos, who described the heart-wrenching aftermath. Body camera footage, partially obstructed but still horrifying, was played, capturing frantic shouts, then the shot, then scream. Finally, was called to the stand. She spoke with a trembling voice, describing her son's trauma, his dreams, his fragile state. Her tears came freely, and she let them. She refused to let anyone doubt the reality of what had happened to her boy. Then, after a moment of hushed deliberation, the court called himself if he felt up to testifying. His heart clenched. She knew it was an enormous emotional burden for him, but the prosecution believed even a brief testimony could sway the jury, letting them see him for who he was, a child. Agreed to try, though anxiety shrouded him. He shuffled to the stand, supported by the bailiff's gentle hand. He wore a plain shirt and slacks, his right arm still occasionally rested in a sling. The judge spoke to him in a calm, gentle tone, explaining that he only needed to tell the truth about what he remembered. Swallowed, gaze flicking for reassurance. Then he spoke. I was just going to the store to get a snack, he whispered. The microphone barely picked up his voice. I had my basketball, it fell, and it made a loud noise on the ground. Then I heard yelling. I got scared and turned around, and his voice broke. He took a shaky breath, tears standing in his eyes. Then it hurt so bad. I didn't do anything wrong. The prosecutor gently led him through the events, letting him describe in his own fragmented way the horror of that afternoon. When he finished, tears glistened on many cheeks in the courtroom. Even some of the jury dabbed at their eyes. Looked devastated, bowing his head, tears trailing down his face. The child's testimony was a powerful blow to the defense's argument that any reasonable person could have seen him as a lethal threat. As the defense rose, the tension in the air sharpened like a blade. Their attorney, a smooth-talking man in a dark suit, approached with a polite nod. He tried to ask gentle, leading questions to poke holes, was moving quickly. Did he possibly have something in his hand that could look threatening in a split second? But each question fell flat in the face of the obvious truth. How could a 10-year-old, arms full of a plastic basketball, be a credible threat? Grew more agitated under the questions, tears creeping into his voice as he insisted he had nothing else in his hand. Mercifully, the cross-examination ended quickly. He was allowed to step down and guided him out of the courtroom, unsure she could stand much more of this. He was trembling. She wrapped her arms around him. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Later, she heard from others that the defense tried valiantly to pivot, to emphasize the split-second decision doctrine. They introduced training manuals, expert witnesses that officers sometimes must make life-or-death calls in an instant. But the prosecutor hammered home that a 10-year-old boy with a ball posed no realistic threat, especially in broad daylight with no visible weapon. By the time closing arguments arrived, the tension was so thick the air felt electric. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. Pundits on the news speculated every which way. The city braced for possible unrest if the verdict wasn't what many hoped for. Sat at home, waiting for the call that the jury had reached a decision. Her stomach was in knots. Sat beside her, holding a stuffed dog a neighbor had given him, eyes staring at the TV but not absorbing anything. Finally, the call came. They made their way to the courthouse, hearts pounding. The chambers were silent as the foreperson stood, clearing her throat. Time seemed to crawl. The verdict was read. On the charge of felony assault with a firearm, we find the defendant, officer, guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find him guilty. A collective exhale burst through the room. Some cried out in relief, some in sorrow, some in rage. Stood there, trembling, tears slipping down his cheeks. The judge set a date for sentencing, explaining that could face multiple years in prison. A hush fell as the reality sank in. The bailiff led him away, and he didn't resist. He simply cast one last pained glance toward, who sat hugging his mother in the front row. The aftermath was a blur. Felt both relief and a strange hollowness. Was justice served? In the eyes of the law, yes. The man who nearly took her son's life would face consequences. But no matter the sentence handed down, it wouldn't erase the trauma, or the scar on his young body and soul. The community erupted in conflicting emotions. Some celebrated, believing it was a rare instance of accountability. Others lamented that a policeman was heading to prison, claiming it was a tragic end for everyone involved. In the weeks that followed, tried to focus on his recovery, both physical and emotional. He took small steps forward. He could walk outside with less fear, though he clutched his hand. He resumed gentle physical therapy, rebuilding strength in his shoulder, eventually dribbling a basketball for a few minutes in the driveway before retreating inside. Therapy sessions with a counselor helped him process some of the nightmares, though they still haunted him occasionally. When the sentencing day arrived, faced a decision. Should she attend and speak at the victim impact statement hearing? Said he couldn't bear to see again, so she went alone. Standing before the court, she spoke her truth. She described how her son's life had changed forever, how he might never again trust the world to protect him. She talked about the sorrow and anger that consumed her in the wake of that gunshot. And she concluded with a quiet statement. "I don't hate you, officer, but you took something from my son that he'll never get back. My hope is that you use the time you have, whether it's behind bars or not, to reflect on how fear and prejudice can destroy lives. My son still lives, but the wound you gave him runs deep." Shackled at the wrists, stood to offer his own final words. He turned toward, voice trembling. "I'll never stop being sorry. I accept whatever punishment the court hands down, and I hope someday you can find peace." With that, the judge pronounced the sentence was to serve 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole in 3. The judge added a stern admonishment about the responsibility officers bear not to let bias or fear overshadow their duty to protect. When it was over, left the courthouse feeling both heavy and somehow lighter. As she reached the sidewalk, the sun broke through the clouds, warming her face. She lifted her eyes to the light, feeling tears slip down her cheeks, unsure if they were tears of relief, sorrow, or a mixture of both. Back home, listened quietly as explained that was going to prison. He just nodded. Later that night, she found him staring at the photo on the mantel, him, smiling wide, wearing a basketball jersey from just a few months ago. He was healthy, carefree, unburdened by these new scars. She stepped up behind him, resting her hands on his shoulders. "Mom," he asked softly, "will I ever feel like that again?" She swallowed, trying to keep her composure. "We'll do everything we can to help you heal, baby," she said. "I promise." He nodded, eyes glistening. Then he turned and hugged her. She held him close, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, so grateful he was still alive. His eyes, once so lively, had a lingering shadow, but she swore to herself she'd do everything in her power to rekindle that light. In the weeks and months that followed, life took on a new rhythm. Resumed classes, albeit part-time at first, and many in the community around him. Started a foundation in his name, aiming to raise awareness about police reform, focusing on de-escalation training and community engagement. People donated, volunteered, and shared stories of hope and survival. Slowly, the city began to heal from the aftershocks of that violent day, though the scar remained, an ever-present reminder of how quickly tragedy can strike when prejudice and fear intersect. His nightmares grew less frequent, and he even managed to join a local youth basketball league for children in need of physical therapy. At first, he moved cautiously on the court, but with each practice, his confidence grew. One sunny afternoon, watched him sink a hoop, the ball swishing clean through the net. He turned to her, a hesitant grin on his face, the first real smile she'd seen in a long time. Tears of pride and relief welled in her eyes, and she clapped, cheering his name. For a moment, the memory of that gunshot faded, replaced by the sound of a bouncing basketball and the echo of children laughing. Still, the journey was far from over. Healing, realized, isn't a single event but a tapestry woven over time, each thread a moment of pain or victory. She carried with her the knowledge that the system remained flawed, that too many mothers still lived with the same fear, that their child might not come home one day because of someone else's fear or prejudice. Yet she found strength in knowing that she had survived something unimaginable. He might always bear the scar, but he also bore a resilience that no bullet could destroy. When his name came up in occasional news reports, she felt a complex swirl of emotions: anger, pity, sorrow. She often wished that day had played out differently. That he had paused, that he had seen as the boy he was, that no bullet had ever been fired. But regrets wouldn't change the past. All she could do was look to the future, determined to protect her son, while also working toward a world where no other child would ever endure what went through. On a bright, crisp morning about a year after the shooting, walked into the living room holding a large envelope. "Mom," he said quietly, "this came in the mail. It has the police department's seal on it." Ola frowned, her heartbeat speeding up. She took the envelope and carefully opened it. Inside was a letter from the new chief of police, acknowledging the anniversary of the shooting, offering regrets, and informing them that new training protocols were being implemented. In a gesture of outreach, the letter stated that the department was committed to genuine reform and community engagement. There was also a note that the chief would be honored if, when he felt ready, might speak to officers about the impact of that day. Felt her stomach twist. She showed the letter to, expecting him to dismiss it, but he surprised her by taking it back, reading it over, and then looking up with thoughtful eyes. "Maybe one day," he said quietly. "But not now." She nodded, a faint warmth in her chest at his willingness, even if it was only a future possibility. He was learning the delicate art of balancing pain, fear, and hope, lessons no 10-year-old should ever have to learn. But life had forced his hand. All that remained was to keep moving forward. Later that afternoon, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, and stood outside, bouncing a brand new basketball on the driveway. He wasn't quite the same exuberant kid he was before, but a spark of that old joy appeared when he made a perfect bounce pass to his mother. She caught it, grinning. A breeze rustled through the oak trees, carrying the distant sounds of traffic and the hum of a city still sorting through its collective trauma. In the glow of the setting sun, mother and son faced each other. Each dribble resonated like a heartbeat. Passed the ball back, letting him practice a shot. It bounced off the rim, no basket this time, but instead of giving up, chased the ball, determination in his gaze. He retrieved it, planting his feet, trying again. This time the ball swooshed cleanly through the net, a triumphant ring echoing down the street. He let out a small whoop of excitement and felt tears sting her eyes again. In that fleeting moment, she saw a glimpse of the future. A future where would carry on, shaped but not defined by the bullet that tore into him. A future where each day was a new chance to reclaim the joy that had been stolen. Under the darkening sky they embraced, the basketball rolling away into the driveway, unheeded. There in the gentle twilight, hope glimmered, fragile yet unwavering, the promise that even after the worst darkness, a new dawn could still rise.